Hello, I am Rafe Fletcher and welcome to the inaugural edition of Conversations with Chartwell. Over the coming months, we'll be sitting down with some of our most influential experts to talk to them about their view on the world. Today, I am delighted to be joined by best-selling author and journalist Tom Wright. Tom spent 13 years with the Wall Street Journal, reporting from Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and most latterly Hong Kong, where he was the paper's Asia economics editor. Tom is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Billion Dollar Whale. Tom is now based in Singapore, where he and his co-author, Bradley Hope, have launched Project Brazen, a new media production studio whose first project, Fat Leonard, is already being turned into a TV series. Tom, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
So Tom, just to give a bit of background on you to our audience, throughout your career, you've uncovered these big tales of corruption. What motivated you to become an investigative journalist? And also, how do you sniff out these stories?
Well, I first got interested in journalism watching The Killing Fields in the 1980s, I think it was, as a middle school kid. That's obviously about Cambodia and a great New York Times journalist who reported there. That's what got me interested in being a journalist back in the day. I first got interested in the 1MDB story when I was working at the Wall Street Journal about 7 years ago now. We were trying to find out, how did this guy Joe Low steal so much money? We knew that this guy had stolen money because local papers in Malaysia had reported it, but we didn't understand how the fraud worked down to the nuts and bolts of it. And so we got involved at the Journal, and we were able to find out the key role of the Prime Minister of Malaysia in helping Joe Low steal that money, Najib Razak, who is now in jail. And that's how we got started on this odyssey all those years ago. And you know, investigative journalism is incredibly rewarding. It's tiring. You have to go through reams of emails and documents, but eventually you get to tell a story, and that's what we did with Billion Dollar Whale. We told a story about how this guy stole billions and billions of dollars.
Great, and I think a lot of our audience will be aware somewhat of the Billion Dollar Whale story. You know, it was a bestseller, it's been in the press, but just to give a bit more background, how did you first come across Joe Low? How did it come across you when you were working at the Journal? And also, I know you briefly said about the Malaysian Prime Minister now ending up in jail as a result of this. What's happened to the other main protagonists from that story?
So the 1MDB story started when a Malaysian newspaper called The Edge broke the story about how Joe Low had stolen a lot of money. Back then, he was an unknown guy, a Malaysian fraudster, a Malaysian businessman who had come across, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars. But at that point, nobody knew Najib Razak's role in the story. He was crucial because Joe Low couldn't have stolen all this money from the Malaysian Sovereign Wealth Fund, 1MDB, without the backing of Malaysia's then Prime Minister Najib Razak. So we actually got to know, first thing we did was we did a story about 1MDB on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And often you get lucky in journalism. It's all about timing. When that story ran on the front page, somebody saw that, somebody in the Malaysian government who was very upset with what Najib was doing, and that person leaked us documents, including Najib's bank accounts. And that's when we saw that he got this, you know, hundreds of millions of US dollars into his bank account. And as a journalist, that was an incredible moment in my career because it's very rare that a sitting prime minister, you would get the bank accounts of a sitting prime minister and be able to prove that that person had taken hundreds of millions of dollars of stolen money into their accounts.
Brilliant, and I want to come on to a story you've run recently, and similarly it focuses upon kind of one fraudster, I mean, kind of quasi-gangster. And this is Fat Leonard, and you've had the podcast, and it's been a huge hit. And I think, you know, it's a chap who's basically managed to corrupt the US Navy. But for those who aren't yet aware, could you, on that front, just give us a little bit of background to how you found Leonard Francis, this figure people couldn't get hold of, this kind of mysterious figure, how he managed to go into business with the world's superpower, the geopolitical repercussions of that, and kind of finally just touch upon his latest escape from house arrest.
Well, there's actually a connection between Leonard Francis, aka Fat Leonard, and Joe Low. Somebody that I knew from my reporting on Billion Dollar Whale got in touch and also knew this guy Leonard Francis. Joe Low and Leonard Francis are both from Penang Island in Malaysia, so there's another connection there. So what Leonard Francis did was he stole at least $35 million from the US Navy, and he created basically a mafia organization inside the US military, whereby he would procure prostitutes, provide Michelin-starred dinners, Cristal champagne, Cohiba cigars to Navy officers, and in return, those Navy officers would make sure that his company got lucrative contracts in the Pacific. What Leonard did was he provided food, fuel, and security to Navy ships, and he made hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. He lived in Nassim Road in Singapore in a $130 million mansion. He had 20 luxury cars, and it was all based off of the incredible amount of US defense spending after September the 11th. So it's just an incredible story, and one that still hasn't been properly told, in my view, because the US Navy had a reason to cover up this story, given that some of its very, very senior Navy admirals were involved with Leonard, enjoying prostitutes that he provided, taking backhand payments in many cases, and a lot of those Navy admirals never ever went to trial because they were protected by the Navy. So
during the recent court case on this story, they've actually used some of your materials, haven't they, in their case against Leonard Francis. What materials were they, and how have they used them, and what's the outcome been?
So what we were able to do was we smuggled in a microphone to Leonard Francis in early last year, and he was under house arrest. Right, he'd been in jail awaiting sentencing. Then he contracted cancer, and so he was allowed into home arrest. We were smuggled in a microphone, and I recorded 25 hours of audio with him during COVID. And what happened was there were 5 Navy officers who were on trial for their involvement with Leonard, and the defense counsel in that case, the defense counsel for those Navy officers, they said, well, look, we want to hear all of those raw tapes of Leonard talking, because Leonard had pleaded guilty. He was a star witness against their clients, and they were trying to impeach him as a witness, which means try to sort of besmirch his name, find stuff in those tapes where Leonard would get struck off as a witness. We thought that was terrible, so we actually challenged that in court, because journalists should be free from anyone rifling through their notebooks, going through their raw tapes. I mean, the First Amendment in America has very strong protections for journalists, but the judge in the case, in our view, made a terrible decision, and she decided to force us to hand over our tapes to the defense counsel. And we did so. We had no choice. We had to follow the court's ruling, but we also put the tapes out to the public, because we said, look, if you're going to mess with our journalistic integrity here, we're also going to make all these tapes available. So Leonard's tapes are out there now for the public to listen to.
And in terms of dealing with him as a character, how do you find that when you're dealing with someone who is, a crook, and as anyone who's listened to the podcast will know, not a nice guy?
Well, the big difference between covering Jolo and covering Fat Leonard is that Jolo didn't really talk to us, and he's on the run in China. He fled Malaysia in 2016 for China, and he's still believed to be there. We're trying to find him at the moment, actually. Fat Leonard, I spent a lot of time talking to him, and so I was able to understand really what a sociopath he is. This is a guy who mistreated all the women in his life. He actually kidnapped his own children from his Filipino girlfriend. And he really was somebody who had a very high estimation of himself. That's why he talked to me for over 25 hours for the podcast, even though that was detrimental, in my view, to his sentencing. And when he realized it was a mistake to have talked for so long for the podcast, I think that's why he went on the run.
And you say he's been on the run. So he's been apprehended now, and what awaits him?
So Leonard, in early September, decided that instead of waiting for his sentencing, which was about to come, and it was really the last piece of this story, all the Navy officers had been either gone to trial or pleaded guilty, and that was all done. A few of them were awaiting sentencing. But Leonard decided to go on the run. He absconded from home arrest, which is from where he'd done his interviews with us. He cut off his GPS monitoring anklet and just went over the border into Mexico. From there, he took a flight to Cuba, and then from Cuba to Venezuela. We were actually able to find him, Bradley and I, my co-founder of Project Brazen and I, via some sources. And we reported first that he was in Venezuela before the US had even located him. He made some very basic errors. He was apparently using a cell phone that was known to the US authorities, so they were able to basically get him that way. And he was arrested trying to board a flight to Russia, which is not that surprising, because he tells us in the podcast how the Russian defense attaché and the Chinese defense attaché were always trying to get him because he knew the inner workings of the US Navy. And what's more, he had all this sexual compromat on US Navy officers. So he would have been a great asset for an enemy of the US like Russia, you know, fighting a proxy war in Ukraine and all of that. And so anyway, as he was trying to board this flight to get to Russia, he was arrested. And we still don't know why. He's still in Venezuela. He must have been betting that the Maduro government in Venezuela has such bad relations with the Biden administration, which doesn't even recognize the Maduro government, that he would never get sent home. But very unluckily for Leonard, recently there's been a thawing of relations between the US and Venezuela, and they just had a prisoner exchange, not including Leonard. Some Americans were sent back and some Venezuelans went home. The oil embargo on Venezuela has been lifted in America. So my bet is that we're going to see Leonard Francis sent back to America, possibly not in the not too distant future. And then, you know, the story just keeps on going. We're always trying to do stories that keep rolling, you know, and they say so much about, you know, the Billion Dollar Whale story says so much about how finance works, the role of Goldman Sachs in that fraud. And this story just shows you the incredible spending in the US military after September the 11th and the utter corruption of that money over many, many years.
And you touch upon there those, you know, the geopolitical repercussions of Leonard Francis, that he could have easily given this information to the Russians, to the Chinese. And for such a thing to happen to the US Navy, you know, it's potentially a huge threat to national security. And going back and, you know, extrapolating from that with Joe Low, obviously, you know, the same way that there's been, you know, things that are catastrophic for the Malaysian state and what he's done and its reputation and its finances. But can these scandals, these acts of corruption, can they all be explained by the actions of two bad, immoral men, or does there have to be something kind of fundamentally wrong with these entities, with these corporations to be corrupted in such a way?
So the key to both the Billion Dollar Whale and the Fat Leonard story is that these aren't just sole actors. These people are enabled by a whole crew of other people. In Jolo's case, Goldman Sachs, the bank, auditors, law firms, even Hollywood elite, all these people who partied with Jolo and you know, made films with his money, they're all somehow involved in the fraud. In Fat Leonard's case, it's all the Navy officers who were, you know, thought they weren't paid enough to serve their country and believed that they should get cash backhanders, Cohiba cigars, Cristal champagne, and prostitute after prostitute as a reward for the job that they were doing for the Navy. So, you know, without these enablers in the system, none of this would ever have happened. You do need these kingpins, the Jolos, the Fat Leonards, to organize everything. And these are the guys who make the most out of it. I mean, it was Jolo living in Beyonce and Jay-Z's apartment in Central Park South. It was Fat Leonard living in a $130 million mansion with Lamborghinis, you know, on the most expensive street in Singapore. But a lot of other people benefited. And in some ways, you can see those people as suckers, right? Because they don't benefit anywhere near as much as Jolo. The ultimate sucker in all of this is Najib Razak, who, you know, he's guilty, he's in jail, he stole money and he used it for his wife, for her diamonds, for his politics. But he didn't steal as much money as Jolo, and only Jolo was at the center of the whole thing. So it speaks to our times, it speaks to how much money there is sloshing around in the system, whether it's military or financial. And there are people who will keep benefiting from it. It's not stopping. I mean, we're seeing it now with crypto and all these people who are ripping off investors and then fleeing into the sunset, right? And it's almost like it's human nature. And the world has gotten so complicated that it's very hard to regulate against these kinds of thefts, right? Because they're transnational. They involve so many different countries, different people. And smart people and greedy people will always find a way to make a killing.
And you say the difficulty of guarding against these kind of thefts. But you know, what do you see that organizations can do to make themselves more watertight and to, you know, prevent these kind of things happening, so that a few bad actors at the top of an organization can't be sucked into these scams?
Well, I think organizations that are serious about anti-money laundering and corruption, they can do something. It's not very difficult. You just have to empower the people who make decisions about corruption in your organization so that they don't feel threatened when someone tries to push through a dodgy deal. You see in Billion Dollar Whale, you see it time and again how Very junior people in compliance get railroaded by the investment bankers. And that was one of the huge problems at Goldman Sachs. The people making the deals, the rainmakers, were always given more power than the people saying, hey, look, this is a corrupt thing. And we see that in the emails, you can see that in all kinds of documents. And so that's really the problem with compliance. Serious organizations, they don't put compliance under some legal entity that's out. They put it right front and center in the CEO's office or somewhere very central, and they empower those people. They even put them on the board. And that's the difference. But again, the problem is that tension between needing to get deals and needing to get paid is still there, and that will tip people over into doing things that are not within the rules of compliance, because they're tempted to try to get that payday and to try to make that deal.
And now talking about your work more generally and what you're doing now, Project Brazen, it's been a really exciting start. We know that Fat Leonard is already now in talks, or you're making a TV series out of that, and that's in development. What else is on the pipeline, and are we going to see this kind of theme of uncovering wrongdoing, corruption? Is that something you are going to be focused on at Project Brazen?
So we've got Fat Leonard, which we're making into a TV series, which is getting written by Peter Chiarelli, who did Crazy Rich Asians. So we're very excited about that. $1 Billion Whale is the pilot's written by a guy called David Henry Hwang, a wonderful playwright. Showrunner is Beau Willimon, who did House of Cards, and that's going to be an amazing TV show as well. Project Brazen, we've got so many shows in the pipeline. We've got a show about a European royal family that's coming out later this year, and it shows really the corruption and dirt at the center of a royal family, a very well-known one. And we're excited for that. It's a podcast, and it's read by an actress. We're doing it in Spanish and in English. We're doing a show about the huge corruption inside the antiquities trade and how museums in the West keep that going. And that's not just a historical thing like the Elgin marbles. That's something that's actually happening today. At Brazen, we always focus on stories that are still ongoing, because we feel audiences engage with those more than historical stories. We've got a music show, untold stories from the world of pop and rock. We've got a business show, so many shows. A show about spies in Silicon Valley. Spying has always been told from the perspective of the Cold War, Russia, America, but this is really like a tech spying story. These are all podcasts. And my colleague Bradley has a book coming out about North Korea, about an attempt to create a sort of parallel government by a bunch of students, no less. So we've got you don't have to look very far in the real world to find just amazing stories. And we're going to keep telling them, because there's almost like an endless supply of these just unbelievable true stories that you don't have to do too much with to fictionalize and turn into a fantastic TV show or film.
Well, I'm glad to hear there's enough nefarious activity out there to keep everyone entertained with these amazing stories. And look, finally, in conversations with Chartwell, we'll be asking all of our thinkers one final question. So Tom, I'm going to ask you, if you had to be stuck in a lift with anyone, who would it be?
Well, I was gonna say some model or something like that, but that's kind of lame. So, and actually, this is even lamer. But I'm going to say Jolo, and the reason is because we never really got the chance to talk to him and to get him to give his side of the story. When the scriptwriters have been fictionalizing him for the TV show, he's almost like a bit of an empty vessel. If you talk to people about Jolo, they'll say, well, he's a nice guy. He gave me a lot of champagne. But to really get inside his heart and his brain, that's a more difficult thing. And I'd love to talk to him. But you know what? I wonder whether if you talk to him, he wouldn't just be also a bit lame, and you wouldn't really get to any proper answers, because he has that veneer of being nice and being sympathetic and giving you what you want, but never really answering questions, right? I'd like to push him so he got angry, and you could really see, like, what is this guy's evil side? What is his, how does he act under pressure? Which nobody has seen, and we weren't even able to put that in the book. So, a heated 30 minutes in a stuck elevator with Jolo.
And hopefully he's claustrophobic or something to really energize him. Well, look, Tom Wright, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.